I've been a park ranger for 15 years now, but my story didn't begin with me. It started 2 generations ago, with my grandfather. He was one of the first rangers when this park opened, a sprawling wilderness of pine forests, winding trails, and misty valleys. Back then, it was more frontier than park, uncharted and untamed. My grandfather wasn't just a ranger, he was a legend. Stories about him have been whispered through the generations of staff. They say he could find a missing hiker the same day they vanished, as though he had a sixth sense. Then came my father, following in his footsteps, and he too quickly earned the same reputation. They used to joke about my family being part bloodhound, blessed with uncanny instincts, or maybe even clairvoyant. I laughed along with them, but I always knew the truth. It wasn't us. It was the book. The survival guide has been in my family for 3 generations now. On the outside, it's unremarkable. A battered leather cover, the edges worn smooth, the pages stained from years of being carried through rain, snow, and mud. But what it does, that's something else entirely. The story goes like this. When my grandfather became a ranger, the land was still rich with the history and culture of the tribe that had lived here for centuries. They'd been relocated, as so often happened, but their connection to the land hadn't faded. One elder, a man my grandfather grew close to, told him stories about the good spirits who dwelled in a freshwater spring deep in the woods. These spirits, he said, watched over the land and the people who respected it. The elder showed my grandfather the edible plants of the forest, where to find drinkable water, and paths that even seasoned hikers didn't know existed. My grandfather, eager to preserve the knowledge, wrote everything down in a plain notebook he carried with him. It became his guide, a compendium of wisdom for navigating the wilderness. Then, one day, everything changed. My grandfather had ventured deep into the woods, following a trail the elder had pointed out. It led to the spring, nestled in a secluded glade where the air felt heavier, quieter, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The water was impossibly clear, the kind of clarity that felt like it could show you things, not just your reflection, but something deeper. As he bent down to drink, the notebook slipped from his pocket and tumbled into the water. He scrambled to retrieve it, but as his fingers touched the leather, the water began to glow, a soft, radiant white light that pulsed like a heartbeat. When he pulled the book out and opened it, he saw the ink from his notes dissolving, vanishing into the pages. He thought he'd lost everything, but he hadn't. The next day, he opened the book to find it wasn't blank. The notes he'd written were back, but they weren't quite the same. They seemed alive, more detailed. And then he noticed something new. Instructions, as though the book was speaking to him. At first, it was simple things, leading him to a patch of wild berries when his stomach growled, or showing a sketch of a creek when he ran out of water. But soon, it became more profound. When hikers went missing, the book would show him maps with trails marked in bold, leading straight to where they were. Once, during a storm, he was lost in the woods himself. He opened the book, and it displayed a drawing of a cave he'd never seen before. When he followed it, he found shelter. Time and again, the book proved itself to be more than just a collection of notes. It was a guide, a guardian. He passed it down to my father when he retired, and my father did the same for me. They both told me the same thing. Respect the book, and it will respect you. Don't question it, don't try to understand it, just trust it. And I have. Even now, after all these years, it still unnerves me. Sometimes when I open it, the words shift on the page, as though the book is alive, thinking, reacting. The ink feels fresh, as though it's still wet. And the things it shows me, well, let's just say it's not always pleasant. I've seen maps with trails leading into the heart of the forest, places so remote they're not on any official chart. I've followed its directions to hikers I had no hope of finding, only to stumble upon them exactly where the book said they'd be. Once, it even showed me a warning, a single word scrawled across the page in jagged letters. Run. I didn't hesitate. I ran, and minutes later, a tree came crashing down where I'd been standing. Coincidence? Maybe. But I've learned better than to doubt it. The park is my life, just as it was for my father and grandfather. I've spent years learning its rhythms, its dangers, its secrets. But no matter how much I think I know, the book always knows more. And while it's been a blessing, it's also a burden. Because sometimes late at night I wonder, what happens when the book decides to stop helping? Or worse, what happens when it shows me something I can't escape? A few months ago, I had one of those rescues that stays with you. 3 teenagers went missing in the woods, a pair of brothers and their cousin. They'd gone out to party, camping in a spot they thought was far enough from the trails to avoid being caught. 2 days passed before anyone noticed they were gone. 2 days is a long time to be lost out here, especially for kids who weren't prepared. When I got the call, I took out the guidebook. As soon as I opened it, a map appeared on the page, ink lines sketching themselves in real time. It led me to a clearing 3 hours from the nearest trail. When I got there, I found a campsite all set up. There was a large tent with 4 rolled-up sleeping bags, an unlit fire pit, a cooler with some food, and a backpack containing basic medical supplies, almost as if the book manifested what I would need after finding the teens. The map in the book showed the campsite, circled in bold, with an arrow pointing deeper into the woods. I followed the arrow, and 45 minutes later, I found them. They looked like they'd been through hell. One of them had a broken leg. He'd fallen off a small cliff while exploring. They'd been trying to help him, but were running out of water and energy. I helped them back to the campsite, used the supplies I'd found to splint the leg, and gave them water. Then I lit the fire and cooked up some food from the cooler. They were asleep within minutes. The next day, with the book guiding me, I led them back to the ranger station. Everyone called me a hero, but I knew the truth. It wasn't me. Then there was the young couple who decided to take an overnight trip. I warned them to stick to the trail, but they didn't listen. The next morning, their car was still in the lot, but they hadn't signed back in. I checked the book, and it showed me a map with their trail marked, then veering off into an area I knew was treacherous. I followed the map, and after a few hours, I found their abandoned gear scattered along a rocky outcrop. The book showed me a sketch of a narrow crevice nearby. When I climbed down, I found them huddled together, scraped and bruised. They'd gotten lost, tried to find their way back, and ended up sliding into the crevice during the night. They were dehydrated and shaken but alive. Using the rope I'd brought and the directions in the book, I got them out and led them back to safety. The couple was grateful, of course, but they didn't understand how close they'd come to disaster. That's the thing about this job. People think it's just luck or skill, but it's not. It's the book. And every time it saves someone, I'm reminded of just how much I owe it and how much it knows. A few weeks ago, a child went missing in the park. A boy, no older than 7, had wandered away from his campsite while his family was setting up for lunch. When his parents called it in, they were frantic. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, and I knew we didn't have much time. Nights in the park are unforgiving, especially for someone so young. I opened the guidebook, expecting the usual: a map, a trail, something to lead me to the boy. But this time, something strange happened. The map appeared as expected, and I set off following it, but every time I got close to the marked location, the ink would blur and shift, rewriting itself to point somewhere else. I spent 8 hours crisscrossing the forest, chasing trails that always seemed to evaporate just before I could reach them. I've never felt so helpless. Exhausted and frustrated, I returned to the ranger station and called my dad. He listened carefully as I described what had happened, and then he told me something I'd never heard before. "I'll be there in the morning," he said. "We'll figure this out together." The next day, my dad and I set out together. But it was the same story. Every time we got close, the map would change, leading us farther into the forest. By nightfall, we were no closer to finding the boy. That evening, my dad made another call to my grandfather. When he returned to the room, his face was pale. "Do you remember the elder's stories about the spirits?" he asked. I nodded. "Well, he didn't just talk about the good spirits. He warned about an evil one, a Wendigo. He said it awakens every 50 years to feed, and no mortal can stop it." The next morning, we prepared for a third day of searching. This time, as we stood at the edge of the forest, we spoke directly to the book, pleading with it to show us the boy and to help us bring him back safely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single word appeared on the page: evil. The ink faded, and the page went blank. We pleaded again, and after what felt like an eternity, new lines began to form. A map appeared, leading to a part of the forest neither of us had ever explored. As we followed it, the trees grew denser, the air heavier. Eventually, we found a hidden path that led to a cave. Inside was a spring, its water glowing faintly. "Is this the spring Granddad found?" I asked. The map disappeared, replaced by a single word: drink. We drank from the spring and filled our canteens. Almost immediately, we felt a strange warmth spreading through us, a sense of clarity and strength. The book redrew the map, and we set off again. 2 hours later, we reached a clearing. In the center stood the Wendigo. It was enormous, its skeletal frame draped in pale, stretched skin. Antlers jutted from its skull, and its eyes burned with a malevolent light. The boy sat on the ground at its feet, seemingly unharmed, but clearly terrified. We stepped into the clearing, and the Wendigo turned to face us. The guidebook in my hand began to glow, its light growing brighter until it was blinding. From the book, a spirit emerged, a white ghostly form like a living mist. It entered us, and suddenly we weren't ourselves. Strength and courage not our own filled us, and we charged. The Wendigo moved with terrifying speed, a blur of claws and antlers. Its screeches echoed through the clearing, a sound that seemed to pierce the soul. My father and I moved as one, blocking its attacks and striking back with a precision that wasn't our own. The spirit guided us, our movements fluid and instinctive. At one point, the Wendigo lashed out with a swipe of its claws, sending me sprawling. My father stepped between us, deflecting the next attack with a strength that seemed impossible. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a fallen branch and wielding it like a weapon. The spirit seemed to amplify our actions, turning simple strikes into devastating blows. The fight raged on, each moment feeling like an eternity. The Wendigo grew more desperate, its movements erratic and frenzied. It let out a final, ear-splitting roar as my father and I struck simultaneously, me with the branch and him with a jagged rock. The creature collapsed to the ground, its body convulsing before it began to crumble. Ash replaced flesh, and the remains melted into the earth, leaving only silence. The spirit left us then, a white mist drifting back into the guidebook. We picked up the boy, who clung to me tightly, and made our way back to the ranger station. The book, however, was blank. No maps, no words, nothing. Even the forest felt different, darker, quieter. A few days later, my father and I returned to the cave. The spring was dark, its glow reduced to a faint flicker. Remembering our canteens, we poured the water we had taken back into the pool. The glow brightened slightly, and then the water began to ripple. A faint, humanoid shape appeared within the light, bowing its head as if in gratitude before dissolving into the spring. We stood in silence, feeling the weight of what had happened. As we stepped out of the cave, the guidebook was no longer blank. A map appeared, leading us home. Now, as I sit here telling this story to my son, who has just become a ranger, I hand him the guidebook. Its leather cover feels warm, alive, as though it knows it's being passed on. Respect it, I say. Trust it, and never forget what it's capable of. My son takes it, his eyes wide with awe and a little fear. He doesn't know what's ahead, but he will. One day, he'll have stories of his own to tell. I hope you enjoyed the story. I will be adding new videos every other day. Please don't forget to like and subscribe or even leave a comment.